Hi, the article that I'm doing is about preparing ideologically clear bilingual teachers, honoring working class and standard language use in the bilingual education classroom. The paper's main goals are the following. First of all, we have finding out a way to deconstruct the biased conscious and unconscious ideologies of bilingual teachers against minority students. This means leaving behind the deficit ideologies that surround the concepts of standard and non-standard language teaching and learning. Second of all, we are preparing bilingual teachers who are critically aware of the mainstream ideologies and are able to protect their minority students from the practices of assimilation into the dominant culture. This means having teachers who are able to evaluate critically their practices and are able to reflect on what is being done inside their classrooms. Third of all, we have having teachers who are able to develop effective tools that can combat repressive practices which are caused by dominant ideologies. The prior literature reviewed in this paper touches on different points. We will start by the dominant discriminatory ideologies. The authors try to investigate the notion of ideology. One of the most important notions is about the erosion of minority ideologies as a result of the dominance and eminence of ruling group. In other words, minorities against the dominant world. The authors note that ideological factors are significant in education. And the reason of such significance is the following, that education is never neutral. Teaching is a political act by its nature. When a teacher goes into the classroom, they bring on their own opinion, their own mindset, their own beliefs. And such opinions do affect the classroom and the students themselves. Teachers enter bilingual education and education in general with biases, which may result in the assimilation of minority students into mainstream culture. How does such process happen? It happens by perpetuating dominant ideologies of powerful groups in schools and institutions. People in power do not have to explicitly exercise discrimination against minority groups, as it has already been done by having a system that serves this purpose. Ruling ideologies are common sense, or they have become common sense because of the eminence of the groups that spread such ideologies. They are perceived to be naturally right and socially acceptable because they are simply prevalent. One example is the ideology of deficit views of linguistic minorities. What does such ideology imply? It implies the non-prestigious status of such groups as they are perceived as inferior. There is a prevalent thinking that speaking a non-standard variety of English or Spanish for that matter is not right, and thus it has to be corrected. I think that this picture says a lot. So this is the dominant group, and we have the minority group, or the law students and income. We have immigrants and all the other minority groups who are being controlled by the dominant group, as the beliefs and the mindset of the dominant group transforms to the minority group. Going on to harmful ideologies, sociopolitical ideologies of bilingual teachers, such as deficit views, can cause unconscious discrimination by marginalizing minority students, despite that some bilingual teachers come from the very same ethnic group as the students. So it's kind of surprising. Why do some bilingual teachers believe and exercise deficit views, although they come from the very same group as the minority students? This is a result of the years of English-only classroom that has created bilingual students and later on teachers who lack standard Spanish skills. In addition to that, this English-only classroom has planted the seed of deficit views in the students/future teachers themselves, and this would be carried on to their future students. Also, it is important to note that teachers' preparation programs efforts are noticeable, but they lack the explicit instruction of dominant ideology and its harmful effect. And this is kind of the main point of the article. It's all about the explicit instruction of ideology and what it can do. So this is also caused by powerful domination. Powerful domination takes place in many forms. It starts mainly with cultural domination, and cultural domination leads to political domination. How does that happen? It happens through persuasion and resistance to any forms of social change that would disrupt the rhythm of powerful relations and construct that has already been formed in the society. So how can we solve such problem? Explicit teaching of ideology and what it entails. Teaching the explicit notion of ideology has rarely been taught to educators and teachers. Research shows that typically teachers hold views that is compatible with the dominant culture, such as deficit views that perpetuate discrimination, racism, and negative perceptions of SES, immigrants, and linguistic minority students. So why is minority education the way it is today? Historically speaking, it is important to note that the education that was offered to non-white, non-European immigrants was exclusively assimilationist in its nature and functioned not to integrate the groups into the dominant culture, but to subordinate and socialize them for second-class citizenship. Also, it is important to know that the assimilation of non-white immigrants is different than white immigrants, and this is why it is the way it is today. Then we move to standard and non-standard languages. Research suggests that social class and linguistic bias do show up in the bilingual classroom, although we might think that it shouldn't show up, but they do show up, and they do show up quite in very powerful forms, and we're gonna see a lot of examples later on. So there's a backfiring effect in which bilingual teachers who want to prepare strong bilingual individuals. Thus, they obligate their students to refrain from using other varieties of their languages. And these teachers, despite their best intentions, they forgot that when you deny someone the will to speak in a certain way, you are by nature denying them their own identities. Moving to the methods and data used in this article, it was mainly observation of 2 veteran teachers, and it was done in a Spanish-English context. It was also done through looking at and analyzing previous literature. The main findings of the article are the following. Current research suggests that prospective teachers hold ideological beliefs and attitudes which reflect dominant ideologies, deficit views, power relations in favor of those in charge. Educators who accept the social order, the power relations, and negative perceptions of SES will likely treat low SES immigrants and linguistic minorities as inferior. This might be done consciously or subconsciously, but it is done anyways. The authors on current research suggest that successful and effective teachers are able to develop a counter approach to dominant ideological practices such as white supremacy, deficit views of low SES, and minority students. So this counter approach is done through effective teaching. So what is effective teaching in this case? So in a classroom in which we have disadvantaged students who are not living up to their potential, we have teachers who are aware of these students and aware of the dominant ideology and what it causes, and these educators acted as advocates and mentors to bring out the potential and deliver fair education opportunities. And we're gonna see some examples of such teachers later on. The authors do provide illustration of deficit views of minority students. One of the examples are the following. It was done in a bilingual classroom, and the context of this classroom was biology, I believe. Yes, it was a science classroom, biology. and it examined the usage of non-standard varieties in the classroom. Yaniel, who is a low Latino SEA student, was describing an experiment that he was doing. The student was able to finish the experiment, and he used the verb wiggled instead of mixed in Spanish. The teacher was observing what is happening, and she went on and she corrected Yaniel's his choice of word. The verb that he used, wiggled, is a non-standard variety of Spanish. She commented that it's not right and it's gross. She said gross. She described the verb that the student has used as gross. So she's already communicating a certain message here. So this implies the teacher's ideological subscription that students should keep both languages separate and avoid code switching, in addition to perceiving other varieties of Spanish as inferior and should not be used. It is important to note that this act was done by a bilingual Latina teacher. The teacher's goal was not to humiliate her student and prevent him from advancing further in life. But despite her best intentions, her act does translate to a deficit view of the student himself, as being an emergent bilingual who is in dire need of rescuing. The rescuing includes correcting his non-standard Spanish to standard Spanish. So imagine what the student's gonna feel after his own Latina teacher, had commented on his choice of word as gross. I mean, that's a pretty strong opinion. Another example is a study done by Ramis and Milk in 1986. Bilingual teachers were asked to rate different varieties of English and Spanish according to their formality and according to how good they are. The first one was standard Mexican Spanish and American English. The second one was the local Spanish variety in that area. The third one, the local Hispanicized English. And then we have the ungrammatical English and Spanish. And lastly, we have Spanish/English code switching, and it was perceived as inappropriate and not correct. And notice that this fifth one, is the most prevalent in the classroom because students do code switch a lot. Moving to the third example, but it was done by Bloom in 1991. Bloom's study was about Latina teachers' attitude toward Mexican American students based on their skin color and their use of standard and non-standard English and Spanish. The finding that the teachers tended to rate lighter-skinned pupils as more attractive and intelligent, and those who spoke close to standard Spanish and English. They were also rated as more intelligent and capable than non-standard speakers. I find these results as really astonishing because this is racism at its finest. Example 4 was done by Malcolms. Yeah, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. This study examines the impact of implicit communicated values in dual language schools on native speakers of Spanish. And it's important to know that the sole purpose of dual language schools is to promote the acquisition of both languages at the same rate. So there is no language that is better than the other one. The findings of this study was that students preferred speaking English over Spanish. Why? There were two main reasons. The teacher's use of formal academic variety of Spanish, so she only used the academic variety of Spanish, and there was her tendency to devalue the non-standard varieties students spoke in the classroom. And second, we have the fact that important standardized tests were administered in English but not in Spanish. So we already have a message going on that English is better, and academic standard Spanish comes after that. Any other non-standard variety is devalued and not appreciated in the classroom. We're going to try to examine the teacher's attitude towards non-standard varieties of English. And The teacher herself was from a local Spanish-speaking community. She expressed a strong commitment to improve education for students like her and believed that Spanish language literacy would improve their chances. Despite her intentions, however, she was devaluing the non-standard varieties that her students spoke, and thus she was denying her own students' identities. She corrected her students' speech and made negative comments about non-standard Spanish and their use of words. And in this certain school, what was happening that we had native English speakers and native Spanish speakers. Whenever the native English speakers spoke any kind of Spanish, they would be applauded and they would be appreciated. And whenever students who speak Spanish as a native language use other varieties of Spanish in the classroom, they were corrected and they were perceived as less. So what was happening in this case, the additive bilingualism for native English speakers and subtractive bilingualism for native speakers of Spanish, because for English speakers, their acquisition of English and Spanish was going on the same rate, but for Spanish speakers, they learned more English and less Spanish, and their own varieties of Spanish were devalued. Example 4, which is a very important example, and it does say a lot about today's classrooms, or it does say a lot about the political situation that is going on. So the context was an English, Spanish, bilingual, and dual language school in Southern California, middle class students. The author herself, Alfaro, interviewed and observed 40 graders. So she interviewed 2 students, Carlos, who is a low SAS native Spanish speaker from Mexican American origin. He was the son of a migrant worker. And we have Brent, a white student, a son of a rancher. And they were both asked the same question: why is it important that you speak both English and Spanish? Carlos answered that he thinks that it is important to speak English and Spanish so that he can get a better job, and he thought that it is better to speak in English. Brent said that I need to learn Spanish so that when I grow up I can tell the workers what to do. In this situation, what do the students' answers imply? Social order has already been established in this situation. Carlos got the idea that you are inferior, English is the only way to go. And the social order and power relations were embedded and already established for these 4th graders. They were 10 years old. They were children. Where did these messages come from? They came from the dominant ideologies that perpetuate language bias. And one of the main solutions to such situation is by examining and challenging the status quo that Spanish is inferior, English is better. Brent is going to end up as the boss, and Carlos is going to end up as the worker. Moving to the implications of the study, one of the main or most important implication was increasing the teacher's ideological clarity is critical, and the importance of the instruction of ideology and sociolinguistic clarity / understanding, implementing the concept. Going to the previous point, sorry. The instruction of ideology can lead to teachers' awareness. Such awareness can create teachers who are effective agents of change when it comes to equitable teaching and social justice. Social and sociolinguistic understanding is expected to give teachers the tools they need to create their structures that will enhance linguistic minority students' ability to acquire standard Spanish and English and provide space and improvement for other varieties of their languages. And it is also important that this process can prevent subordination in which these students go through. Another implication is about implementing the concept that there is no language better than the other one. No language, including dialects, are inferior or superior. Why? From a linguistic point of view, non-standard and standard languages are inherently equal linguistically, as no language is inferior or superior. They all follow linguistic rules, syntax, have a sound system, phonology, use particular words, lexicon, and mark words in particular ways, morphology. Incorporating and advocating cultural wealth in educational institutions is key. So this means that the notion of cultural wealth should be implemented. The notion of cultural wealth includes 7 dimensions. We have familial capital, social capital, navigational capital, resistant capital, linguistic capital, and aspirational capital. For the sake of this article, we're going to discuss the linguistic capital, which refers to the intellectual and social skills attained through communication experiences in more than one language and style, such as translating and interpreting abilities, creative storytelling, and other oral cultural skills. In other words, we're talking about code switching and going from one language and another. The incorporation of cultural wealth in the classroom can be done effectively, and this is going to be shown in the studies that I'm going to discuss later. But how can this model be utilized, and how can we convince those in charge that such model is effective? We can do that by using the body of literature, the growing body of literature as evidence, as it supports code switching and the use of Spanish English, as the goal is to utilize these linguistic characteristics which minority students possess. It is also important to teach the notion of translanguaging. It refers to the creative ways bilingual use language to make meaning, and it can be used to maximize their communicative potential, as bilinguals often move fluidly between Spanish and English, as well as standard and non-standard vernaculars. Translanguaging is seen as multiple discursive practices in which bilingual engage in order to make sense of their bi or multilingual words. So this translanguaging that is found in the classrooms today is actually an asset, not a weakness. We have Martini's study as a proof. It was done in a classroom. We have sixth grade Mexican American students who do code switch a lot. The teacher asked a student to explain their code switching practices, why do they do it, and how. This resulted in increasing the metalinguistic awareness of the students, because the students are now more aware of how these processes take place in their brains, because they were able to explain the process to their teacher. This tool helps the students in achieving higher and more challenging linguistic goals, such as accomplishing important state-required language functions. These language functions, such as clarifying, reiterating utterances, quoting and reporting speech, joking and teasing, establishing solidarity and intimacy, shifting voices, etc. It did result in increasing the metalinguistic awareness of the students. Martinez and the teacher used code switching to tap into the students' metalinguistic awareness by utilizing the same linguistic tools. The teacher tapped into that by helping them transfer the code switching skills, and he did that by shifting the voices for different audiences and communicating subtle nuances and meaning to their academic writing. So their entire code switching process was transformed from speaking itself to writing, academic writing. Finally, we have Sayre's study. Sayre says that utilizing this study, the main goal of this study is utilizing the students' linguistic resources. This teacher acted as an advocate for her students' myriad linguistic practices. She did that when she allowed her students to code switch, use archaic forms of Spanish, speaking rural varieties of Mexican Spanish without castigating them. She instead celebrated their multilingual skills and allowed them to use such languages. What this teacher did is important because it does imply the recognition to need to contest language ideologies that favor dominant languages by developing translanguaging instruction that, first of all, teaching the standard language through the vernacular, using the vernacular to mediate academic content, like in the previous study, impart lessons that instill ethno-linguistic consciousness and pride. If teachers were aware of these three goals, then minority students would not feel as inferior. The authors conclude by the following: we similarly encourage bilingual educators to devise a pedagogy that encourages linguistic minority students to tap and proudly display their linguistic wealth in the classroom and to build on it as a strategy for appropriating standard academic discourses in both target languages. The author does also include a quote I found this quote in the article and it did hit home. So if you want to really hurt me, talk badly about my language. Ethnic identity is twin skin to linguistic identity. I am my language. Until I can take pride in my language, I cannot take pride in myself. Until I can accept as legitimate Chicana student Texas Spanish, Tex-Mex, and all the other languages I speak, I cannot accept the legitimacy of myself. Until I am free to write bilingually and to switch codes without having always to translate, while I still have to speak English or Spanish, when I would rather to speak Spanglish. And as long as I have to accommodate the English speakers rather than having them accommodate me, my tongue will still be illegitimate. I will no longer be made to feel ashamed of existing. I will have my voice, Indian, Spanish, white. I will have my separate serpent's tongues, my woman's voice, my sexual voice, my poet's voice. I will overcome the tradition of silence. I will conclude this facilitation by my critique in the article. I found this article to be very rich in its content. It tapped on historical and political backgrounds of why the situation it is the way it is today. She did not only describe they did not only describe the problem, they went into the root of the problem, which is the dominant ideology. They utilized recent studies and older ones, which did make a lot of sense because it says that this discrimination has been going on since a very long time, or has been going on for a very long time. It challenged bilingual teachers because they are part of the problem. It did tell them that, hey guys, I know you're bilingual teachers, you're Latina teachers in this situation, but you are held accountable for your own actions because despite your best intentions, you might be destroying your students as well. And finally, what I like the most about this article, that it included both standard varieties and non-standard varieties of dominant languages. It did not only specify English and Spanish, it went on into the non-varieties of Spanish, and it did state that standard academic Spanish is favorable in such communities. Yeah, that's it.